Today,
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're doing things a little differently. We're not just summarizing a podcast script. It's actually a pretty long one. It's called Learn English at Home, Your Ultimate Guide. And it's like 4 hours long.
wow, 4 hours.
Yeah, so we're not going to go through the whole thing, obviously, but we're going to pick out like the most interesting and useful parts. Think of it like a cheat sheet or like a highlight. Welcome.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a world many of you might be familiar with or dreading, the U.S. visa interview.
Oh, yeah.
You sent us a really intriguing clip from EnglishPod, an English language learning podcast, and they actually do a mock visa interview. I thought it was brilliant. It really highlights how something seemingly straightforward can be surprisingly comple's.
It is, isn't it? And you're right. The EnglishPod example is perfect for this. It's not just about having your paperwork in order.
Right.
Today we're doing things a little differently. We're not just summarizing. The deep dive. Today we're doing things a little differently. We're not just summarizing a podcast script. It's actually a pretty long one. It's called Learn English at Home, Your Ultimate Guide. And it's like 4 hours long.
Wow, 4 hours.
Yeah. So we're not going to go through the whole thing. But we're going to pick out like the most interesting and useful parts. We're not just summarizing a podcast script. Think of it like a cheat sheet or like a highlight reel called
I like that.
Learn English at Home, Your Ultimate Guide. And it's like and it doesn't matter if you're just starting out or if you've been learning English for a while. Yeah. There's going to be something here for everyone. So let's dive the whole thing right in. But we're going to pick out like the really interesting and useful part. We're not just summarizing a podcast. Think of it like a cheat sheet or like starts in a kind of unexpected place. It doesn't jump right into grammar or vocabulary.
Oh, really? Where does it start?
Well, it asks you a really simple but profound question. Why are you learning English?
To better English. That's interesting.
And it's
I guess I never really thought about it. I just know that I need to learn it.
Yeah, and the script really emphasizes how important it is to have a personal goal for learning English. It even gives some examples like wanting to travel or get a better job.
Today, we're diving into a world many of you might be familiar with or dreading, the U.S. visa. Sent us a really intriguing clip from EnglishPod, an English language learning podcast, and they actually do a mock visa interview. I thought it was brilliant. It really highlights how something seemingly straightforward can be surprisingly complex.
It is, isn't it? And you're right. The EnglishPod example is perfect for this. It's not just about having your paperwork in order.
Right.
It's about navigating a conversation where cultural education and even a bit of psychology come into play.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The mock interview on EnglishPod focuses on a B2 visa, which is for tourists.
Right.
And Liam and Emma, the podcast hosts, specifically mentioned that the interviewee has an accent. What does that tell us right off the bat?
It immediately throws in the element of communication across cultures and accents. Think about it. Even in a practice scenario, they're acknowledging that accents can impact how you're perceived and understood. And in a real visa interview where the stakes are so high, that pressure intensifies.
Right. It's like you're already nervous about the interview itself, and then you layer on this potential for misunderstanding because of an accent.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how often those kinds of miscommunications happen in real life interviews.
More often than you'd think, unfortunately. And that's why the EnglishPod example is so valuable. It gives us a chance to analyze those potential pitfalls and think about how to navigate them.
Exactly. So they talk about the B2 visa, but they also mention J1 visas, which are for exchange visitors.
Right.
I remember feeling so much anxiety when I was applying for my student visa.
Absolutely. Each visa type carries a weight of expectation and often a lot of personal hopes and dreams. For a student applying for an F1 visa, it's getting permission to enter the U.S.
Right.
It's about the chance to pursue an education, build a future. The interview becomes a gateway to those aspirations.
And for someone on a J1, maybe it's about a once-in-a-lifetime chance to experience another culture or contribute to a research project. It's not just ticking boxes on a form. It's about the future you're trying to create.
Precisely. And that's where the human element comes in. The visa officer isn't just looking at documents. They're trying to assess your intentions, your credibility, your potential contribution. And all of that has to be conveyed through communication, often in a language that might not be your native tongue.
It makes you realize how much pressure is on the applicant to articulate their story, their purpose, their genuineness, all within the confines of this formal interview.
And to do it in a way that resonates with the interviewer, who might come from a completely different cultural background with different communication styles and expectations. It's a fascinating dynamic.
So how do we unpack that dynamic? What can we learn from the EnglishPod mock interview about how to effectively communicate in this high-pressure situation, especially when accents are involved?
Well, what's fascinating about the EnglishPod example is that they actually highlight a few key moments where the interviewee's accent almost leads to a misunderstanding. It's subtle, but it's there.
Okay.
And by analyzing those moments, we can start to uncover some really valuable insights.
All right, I'm hooked. Let's dive into those specific moments from the EnglishPod interview. What were some of the phrases or interactions that stood out to you?
There's a point where the interviewee uses a colloquialism that the interviewer doesn't quite grasp. It's a common phrase in the interviewee's culture, but it causes a momentary pause in the conversation. That's a perfect example of how even small language nuance impact.
Oh, that's a great example. It's like you're using language that could be misinterpreted or misunderstood.
Yeah.
I'm guessing those kinds of situations happen all the time in real visa interviews.
All the time. And that's why it's so important to not only be aware of your own communication style, but also to be prepared for those moments of potential confusion.
So what's the takeaway here for our listener who might be facing a visa interview in the future?
I'd say awareness is key. Be mindful of the words you choose, especially if they're culturally specific. And don't be afraid to politely clarify if you sense that something hasn't been understood.
That's such a good point. It's about being proactive in the communication process, not just passively hoping for the best.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that clear communication is a shared responsibility. Both the interviewer and the interviewee need to be actively engaged in ensuring that the message is being conveyed and received accurately.
All right, so we've touched on the different types of visas and the added pressure of communicating with an accent.
Yeah.
But what about the bigger picture? What's the overarching goal of the visa interview from the perspective of the visa officer?
Well, as we hinted at earlier, it's about assessing credibility and intentions. They're looking for inconsistencies, anything that raises a red flag.
Okay, so it's not just about checking boxes and making sure your paperwork is in order.
Not at all. It's about piecing together a puzzle. They're trying to understand who you are, why you want to enter the U.S., and whether your story aligns with the requirements of the visa you're applying for.
So like a mini investigation. That sounds pretty intense.
In a way, yes. And that's why preparation is so important. The more you understand the purpose of the interview, the better equipped you'll be to navigate it successfully.
All right, let's talk about preparation. What are some concrete things our listener can do to prepare for their visa interview?
Well, first and foremost, know the specific requirements for your visa category. What documents are needed? What are the key eligibility criteria? Once you have that foundation, you can start to anticipate the types of questions you might be asked.
So it's about researching your specific visa category and then almost reverse engineering the interview right. Thinking about what the interviewer might be looking for and preparing your answers accordingly.
Exactly. It's about putting yourself in their shoes and understanding their perspective.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And what about the actual interview itself? Were there any strategies for communicating effectively, especially if you have an accent or are nervous about being misunderstood?
Absolutely. And this is where practicing beforehand can be invaluable. Even something as simple as recording yourself answering common interview questions can be incredibly helpful.
Wait, really? Just recording yourself and listening back. Why is that so helpful?
It allows you to hear yourself the way others hear you. You might be surprised by how your accent sounds or how certain phrases come across. It gives you a chance to adjust your pronunciation, your pace, your word choice to ensure that you're communicating as clearly as possible.
Wow, that's such a simple but brilliant tip. I never thought of that. It's like giving yourself a mini mock interview and then having the opportunity to critique and refine your responses.
Precisely. And it allows you to get comfortable with the flow of the interview, to anticipate potential questions, and to build your confidence, especially if you're worried about your accent. This kind of practice can be incredibly reassuring.
So we've talked about preparation, but what about the emotional side of things? Visa interviews can be incredibly nerve-wracking, especially if you're already feeling anxious about your accent or potential cultural misunderstandings.
You're absolutely right. The emotional aspect is huge, and one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give is to try to stay calm and focused. Remember, the visa officer is just doing their job. They're not there to trick you or make you feel uncomfortable.
That's a good reminder. It's easy to get caught up in the pressure and forget that the interviewer is also just a person trying to do their best in a sometimes challenging situation.
Exactly. And if you can approach the interview with that mindset, with a sense of respect and understanding, it can go a long way in diffusing any tension and fostering a more positive interaction.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about different visa types, the importance of clear communication, especially when accents are involved, and some practical tips for preparing for the interview. But I'm curious, what are some common misconceptions people have about visa interviews?
One of the biggest misconceptions is that the visa officer is looking for reasons to deny your application.
Oh, really?
While they do have to be thorough, their primary goal is to assess your eligibility and make a fair decision based on the information presented.
So it's not like they're starting from a place of suspicion.
Not at all. They approach each interview with a neutral stance, and it's up to the applicant to demonstrate their qualifications and intentions.
That's reassuring to know. And what about the idea that having an accent will automatically hurt your chances? Is that true?
It's a common fear, especially for those who aren't native English speakers. But remember, clear communication is a two-way street. While it's important to articulate your answers, clearly the visa officer is also responsible for ensuring understanding.
So if they're not understanding you, it's okay to politely ask for clarification or rephrase your answer.
Absolutely. And it might even demonstrate your ability to adapt and communicate effectively, which can be a positive thing.
That's a really empowering message. It's like you're not powerless in this situation. You have agency and the ability to advocate for yourself.
Exactly. And that confidence can make a big difference in how you're perceived. Remember, the visa interview is a conversation. It's a chance to present your case, to tell your story, and to demonstrate why you deserve to be granted a visa.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's not just a test you have to pass. It's an opportunity to showcase who you are and what you bring to the table.
Precisely. And that shift in perspective can make all the difference in how you approach the interview and ultimately how you feel about the entire process.
This has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of the complexities involved in a visa interview, and I'm sure our listener does too.
And hopefully they're starting to see the bigger picture here, that even seemingly simple interactions can be far more intricate than they appear.
So true. But we've only just scratched the surface, haven't we? There's still so much more to uncover about the nuances of communication, cultural awareness, and the psychology at play in a visa interview.
Absolutely. And that's what we'll be diving into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll be exploring specific examples from the EnglishPod mock interview, analyzing those moments where communication could have gone awry, and offering concrete strategies for navigating those potential pitfalls.
I can't wait. It's like we're detectives piecing together a puzzle, uncovering the hidden layers of meaning and communication in this seemingly straightforward interaction. Stay tuned, listeners, because it's about to get really interesting.
So picking up where we left off, let's revisit that EnglishPod mock interview. Remember, they set it up with an interviewee who has an accent, which adds this whole other layer of complexity to the interaction.
Right. And I remember you mentioning that there are a few moments in the interview where the accent almost leads to a misunderstanding. Can we dive into those specifics? Because I think that's where the real learning happens.
Yeah.
You know, seeing how those nuances can actually play out in a real conversation.
Absolutely. There's this one moment where the interviewee is explaining their travel plans, and they use the phrase popover to describe a quick visit to a neighboring state.
Okay.
Now, in their native language and culture, that phrase might be perfectly commonplace. But to the interviewer's ear, it sounds a bit casual, almost flippant. And you can almost feel this little bit of tension in the air as the interviewer tries to clarify what the interviewee means.
Oh, wow, I see what you mean. It's like the interviewee is just using a normal expression from their everyday language, but in the context of this formal interview, it comes across differently. It makes you wonder if they even realize how their words might be interpreted.
And that's the thing, isn't it? We often don't realize how much our cultural background and language habits influence our communication style. And in a situation like a visa interview where every word matters, those subtle nuances can have a real impact.
So what's the takeaway for our listener here? How can they avoid those kinds of miscommunications if they're in a similar situation?
It's a great question, and it goes back to that awareness we were talking about earlier. If you know you have an accent or tend to use colloquialisms, it's helpful to be extra mindful of your word choice in a formal setting, like an interview. Think about how your words might be perceived by someone from a different background.
So it's almost like having two sets of ears, right? Your own ears and the ears of the listener who might be hearing your words through a completely different cultural and linguistic filter.
Exactly. And it's not about changing who you are or erasing your accent. It's about being aware of the potential for miscommunication and taking steps to bridge that gap. Sometimes it might be as simple as explaining a colloquialism or choosing a more formal synonym.
It sounds like a lot of it comes down to that active listening and being willing to clarify if you sense any confusion on the part of the listener.
Precisely. And it goes both ways, of course. Yeah. The interviewer should also be actively listening, asking for clarification, and trying to understand the interviewee's perspective.
Okay, so that's one example. Were there any other moments in the EnglishPod interview where the accent almost tripped things up?
Yes. There's another point where the interviewee is talking about their financial situation, and they use a term that's specific to their country's banking system. Again, it's something that's perfectly clear to them, but the interviewer has no frame of reference for it. And you can hear the interviewee getting a little flustered as they try to explain it, which of course just makes the situation more stressful.
Oh, I can totally relate to that.
Yeah.
I remember when I was traveling abroad and I kept using banking terms that people just didn't understand. It's so frustrating when you feel like you can't explain something simple because of a language barrier.
And it's that frustration, that feeling of not being understood, that can really throw you off in an already high-pressure situation like a visa interview.
So what's the solution? How can you prepare for those moments when you know you're going to have to explain something that's culturally or linguistically specific?
Well, one strategy is to anticipate those potential stumbling blocks. If you know you're going to have to talk about your finances, for example, think about the terms you might need to use and how you might explain them in a way that's clear to someone who isn't familiar with your country's banking system.
So it's almost like doing a mini translation in your head, right? Taking a concept that's familiar to you and finding a way to express it in a way that will make sense to someone from a different background.
Exactly. And it might involve using analogies, providing context, or breaking down complex concepts into simpler terms.
Okay, so we've talked about anticipating potential language barriers and being prepared to clarify or rephrase. But are there any other strategies our listener can use to communicate more effectively in a visa interview, especially if they're worried about their accent?
Absolutely. One thing that often gets overlooked is the power of nonverbal communication. Things like eye contact, facial expressions, and body language can play a huge role in conveying your message and building rapport with the interviewer.
That's so true. I've definitely been in situations where I could tell that someone wasn't understanding my words, but they could still sense my sincerity or my enthusiasm through my nonverbal cues. It's like communication goes beyond just the words we speak.
Absolutely. And in a visa interview where you're trying to convey not just information, but also your genuine intentions, your passion, your credibility, those nonverbal signals can be incredibly powerful.
So how can our listener use nonverbal communication to their advantage in a visa interview?
Well, first and foremost, maintain good eye contact. It shows that you're engaged, attentive, and confident. But be mindful of cultural differences here. In some cultures, direct eye contact might be considered rude or aggressive, so it's always good to do a little research beforehand to understand the norms of the culture you're interacting with.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
What might be considered polite in one culture could be interpreted as disrespectful in another. It's about being sensitive to those nuances and adapting your communication style accordingly.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just eye contact. Think about your facial expressions. Are you smiling? Do you look approachable and friendly? Or are you frowning or looking tense? Your facial expressions can convey a lot about your emotional state, and they can either help or hinder your ability to connect with the interviewer.
Right. It's like if you're smiling and looking genuinely happy to be there, it sends a message of openness and warmth that can really help to put the interviewer at ease.
And don't underestimate the power of body language. Sit up straight. Make sure you're facing the interviewer and use hand gestures to emphasize your points. But again, be aware of cultural differences. Some gestures that might be perfectly harmless in your culture could be offensive in another.
Okay, so we've covered eye contact, facial expressions, and body language. Are there any other nonverbal cues that our listeners should be aware of?
Well, one that's particularly relevant when you're dealing with language barriers is mirroring. It's a subconscious behavior where we tend to mimic the posture and gestures of the person we're interacting with. It's a way of building rapport and showing that we're on the same wavelength.
Oh, that's fascinating. So if the interviewer is leaning forward and I subtly lean forward too, it creates a sense of connection and understanding.
Exactly. And it can be especially helpful in situations where verbal communication is challenging. By mirroring the interviewer's body language, you're sending a nonverbal signal that you're listening, that you're engaged, and that you're trying to connect with them on a deeper level.
Wow. It's amazing how much communication happens beneath the surface, isn't it? It's like we're constantly sending and receiving signals without even realizing it.
It is, and the more we understand those subtle cues, the more effectively we can communicate, especially in challenging situations like a visa interview.
So we've talked a lot about the interviewee's perspective, but what about the interviewer? What are some things they can do to ensure clear communication, especially when the interviewee has an accent or is from a different cultural background?
Well, one of the most important things is to be patient and understanding. Remember, the interviewee might be nervous, they might be struggling to find the right words, and they might be feeling self-conscious about their accent.
Right. It's like they're already in this high-pressure situation, and then they have this added layer of anxiety about being misunderstood because of their accent or cultural background.
Yeah.
It's a lot to handle.
It is, and that's why it's so important for the interviewer to create a welcoming and supportive environment. Simple things like smiling, making eye contact, and using encouraging body language can go a long way in putting the interviewee at ease.
It's like you're sending a nonverbal message that says, I'm here to listen. I'm here to understand, and I want you to succeed.
Exactly. And that can make all the difference in the world.
All right, so we're back, and I'm really excited to dive into this next layer of the visa interview puzzle. We've talked about the practicalities, the language nuances, but now let's get into the psychology of it all.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because beneath the surface of this formal interaction, there's this whole undercurrent of emotions, perceptions, and cultural influences at play.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes the EnglishPod example so compelling. You can almost feel the tension and the vulnerability of the interviewee as they navigate this high-stakes conversation, especially with the added pressure of communicating with an accent.
Absolutely. Imagine you're the interviewee in that scenario. You've likely invested a lot of time, money, and emotional energy into this visa application. It's tied to your dreams, your aspirations, maybe even your entire future.
Right, and then you're in this unfamiliar environment facing an authority figure who holds the power to grant or deny your request. It's a recipe for stress and anxiety.
And that stress can manifest in so many ways. It can affect your ability to think clearly, to articulate your thoughts, to even understand the questions being asked.
It's like your brain goes into fight or flight mode, and suddenly you can't remember simple words or phrases. I know I've definitely had those moments where my mind just goes blank under pressure.
And that's where things can get really tricky, especially if you're already dealing with the added pressure of communicating in a language that's not your native tongue.
So what happens when you combine that stress response with the complexities of cross-cultural communication?
Well, it can create a perfect storm for misunderstanding. Think about it. You're nervous. You're trying to process information in a language that might not be completely familiar, and you're hyper-aware of your accent and how you're being perceived.
Right. It's like all of your insecurities are magnified in that moment. And on the flip side, the interviewer might also be bringing their own biases and assumptions to the table.
Exactly. We all have unconscious biases, and those biases can be triggered by things like accents, cultural background, even body language.
So it's like this invisible layer of perception is influencing the entire interaction, shaping how the interviewer views the interviewee and vice versa.
Precisely, and that's why it's so crucial to be aware of these dynamics, both from the perspective of the interviewee and the interviewer.
Okay, so let's break this down. What are some specific things that the interviewee can do to manage their stress and anxiety in a visa interview?
Well, one of the most effective strategies is preparation. The more prepared you are, the more confident you'll feel, and less likely you are to be overwhelmed by stress. This means researching the visa requirements, thoroughly practicing your answers to common interview questions, and even doing some role-playing with a friend or family member.
So it's about familiarizing yourself with the process, anticipating potential questions, and having those responses ready to go.
Exactly. And it's not just about memorizing answers, it's about internalizing the information, understanding the logic behind the questions, and being able to articulate your thoughts and intentions clearly and concisely.
It's like the more comfortable you are with the material, the less likely you are to get flustered or thrown off by unexpected questions.
Precisely. And beyond preparation, there are other things you can do to manage your anxiety in the moment. Deep breathing exercises, visualization techniques, even just taking a few moments to center yourself before the interview can make a huge difference.
It's like you're giving your nervous system a chance to calm down and reset before you enter that high-pressure situation.
And it's also about shifting your mindset. Instead of viewing the interview as a test you have to pass, try to see it as an opportunity to share your story, to connect with another human being, and to advocate for yourself and your dreams.
I love that. It's about reframing the narrative and focusing on the positive aspects of the experience.
And remember, it's okay to be nervous. It's a natural human response to a stressful situation. The key is to not let that nervousness control you.
So we've talked about managing stress from the interviewee's perspective. But what about the interviewer? What can they do to create a more welcoming and supportive environment?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, it starts with awareness. Recognizing that the interviewee might be feeling anxious and trying to put them at ease. Simple gestures like smiling, making eye contact, and using a friendly tone of voice can go a long way.
It's about creating a sense of warmth and humanity in what can often feel like a very sterile and intimidating environment.
And it's also about being patient and understanding. If the interviewee is struggling to find the right words, or if their accent is making it difficult to understand them, don't rush them or make them feel self-conscious. Give them the time and space they need to express themselves.
It's about recognizing that communication is a two-way street and that the interviewer has a responsibility to ensure that the conversation is flowing smoothly.
Exactly. And if you're struggling to understand the interviewee, don't be afraid to ask for clarification. You could say something like, "I'm sorry, could you please repeat that? I want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly."
Right. It's about being honest about your own difficulty understanding and working together to bridge that communication gap.
And it's also about being mindful of your own body language and tone of voice. Are you coming across as judgmental or impatient? Or are you conveying a sense of openness and empathy?
It's like you're setting the tone for the entire interaction with your nonverbal cues. If you're projecting warmth and understanding, it's more likely that the interviewee will feel comfortable and relaxed.
And that can make all the difference in the quality of the communication and ultimately the outcome of the interview.
So what are some key takeaways for our listener, whether they're preparing for a visa interview themselves or simply trying to understand the complexities of cross-cultural communication?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that communication is a lot more nuanced than we often realize. It's not just about the words we speak, it's about the emotions we convey, the cultural context we bring to the table, and the unconscious biases that shape our perceptions.
It's like there's this whole hidden layer of meaning that's being communicated beneath the surface of our words.
Exactly. And the more we understand those hidden layers, the more effectively we can navigate those tricky cross-cultural interactions.
And I think another key takeaway is the importance of empathy. Whether you're the interviewee or the interviewer, trying to see the world from the other person's perspective, understanding their challenges and recognizing their humanity can make a huge difference in the quality of the communication and the outcome of the interaction.
Absolutely. Empathy is the foundation of effective communication, especially in situations where there's potential for misunderstanding.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I feel like I've gained a whole new appreciation for the complexities of the visa interview process, and I'm sure our listener has too.
And hopefully they'll walk away from this conversation. Welcome to the deep dive. You know, today we're doing things a little differently. We're not just summarizing a podcast script. It's actually a pretty long one. It's called Learn English at Home, Your Ultimate Guide. And it's like 4 hours long.
Wow, 4 hours.
Yeah. So
welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a world many of you might be
to the deep dive.
familiar with or dreading.
You know, today we're doing things a little differently. We're not just summarizing a podcast script. It's actually a pretty long one. It's
Welcome
called
to the
Learn
dive.
English at home.
Today, we're
ultimate
diving
guide.
into a
And it's
world
like
many of you might be
4
familiar with or
hours
dreading,
long.
the
Wow,
U.S. visa
4
interview.
hours.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You sent
so
us
we're
a
not going
really
to go through the whole
intriguing clip from
thing,
EnglishPod, an English
obviously,
language learning
but we're
podcast,
going to pick out like
and they
the
actually
most
do a mock
interesting and
visa
useful
interview.
part. Think of it like a
Brilliant.
cheat sheet.
It really highlights
like a
something
highlight reel.
seemingly straightforward. It can be surprisingly better English.
Exactly. It is, and it doesn't matter. And you're just English learning. An example, if you've been learning English for a while, not just about having going to be your paperwork. Something here for everyone. It's about navigating a conversation where cultural awareness. Let's dive right in. Clear communication. So the first thing that really struck me about this script was that it's to play.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The mock interview on EnglishPod focuses on a
grammar or vocabulary,
which is for tourists.
Right.
And
Where does
Liam
it
and Emma,
start?
the
Well, it
podcast
asks you a
hosts,
really simple but
specifically
profound
mentioned that
question.
the interviewee has an accent.
Why are you learning English?
What does that tell us right off the bat? That's interesting.
Immediately
I
throws
guess
in the
I
element of
never really thought
communication
about it. I
across
just know that I need to learn
cultures
it.
and accents. Think about it. Even in a really practice scenario, they're acknowledging that accents can impact how you're perceived and understood for learning English. And in a real visa interview where the stakes are so wanting to travel or get better, that pressure intensifies.
Right.
Even just for the
It's
pure
like you're
enjoyment
already nervous about the interview itself. I can see how that would make a big difference. And then you layer on this potential for misunderstanding because of an accent. You're doing something. It makes you wonder how you're more likely to happen in real life interviews.
It's like when I'm learning something new, I think, unfortunately, try to find something that really and that's my interest. Why the EnglishPod, if I don't have that intrinsic value motivation, it gives so much a chance to analyze those potential pitfalls. What about you? Think about what keeps you motivated when you're learning.
Exactly. Well, for me, it's all. So they talk about the expanding my perspective. Also, they mention, each new thing I learned is like a new lens to traverse the world through.
That's a beautiful way to put it. I love that.
And the script makes it. I just remember feeling so much anxiety when I was applying for my student visa. Finding your why isn't just some
Each visit
good
type
exercise.
Carries a weight of expectation.
It's actually crucial
and
for staying committed in the long run.
It's like you wouldn't start a road trip without knowing where you're going. For a student applying for an F1 visa, it's not just about getting permission to enter the U.S. You move forward. It's about the chance to pursue an education, build a future.
On your destination,
the interview becomes a gateway to those aspirations.
And for someone on less discouraging, maybe it's about a once-in-a-lifetime chance to experience another culture or contribute to a research project. Then tackles this not just ticking boxes on almost scary idea of fluency. The future.
I remember that part precisely. It actually advises where the human element comes in. Fluency. The visa officer isn't just looking at sole target documents, which they're trying to assess your intentions, your
fluency,
credibility, your potential contribution, and all of that has to be conveyed through communication.
If you don't
often
see
in a language
yourself reaching
that might not be your native tongue.
Totally. How much
and that's where the script
is on the
really
applicant
smart.
To articulate.
It suggests breaking down that huge goal of fluency into smaller, more manageable steps.
So instead of saying, I want to be fluent, you might say, this week I'm going to get a master ordering coffee in English. Or I'm going to learn 20 new vocabulary words about cooking.
I love that because each small win builds your confidence, right? It's like you're leveling up in a video game. Each level you conquer makes you feel more capable of tackling the next one.
You got it. And the script highlights how this approach is actually backed by psychology. There's something called the Zeigarnik effect, which basically means we're more motivated to finish tasks that are already in progress. So by constantly setting and completing these mini goals, you're kind of tapping into this built-in motivation system.
That's fascinating. So we've got our why, and we're setting achievable goals. What's next on this language learning roadmap?
Okay, so speaking of building skills, the script dives into one that we're actually using right now.
Let me guess. Is it vocabulary?
Even more fundamental than that, it's listening.
Oh, right. It's funny how we often overlook how crucial listening is to actually learning a language.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's like the foundation upon which everything else is built. And the script offers a ton of suggestions. Watching movies, listening to podcasts, audiobooks, the list goes on and on.
I remember there was one tip in particular that caught my eye. It was about transcribing.
Oh yeah, transcribing basically means you pick a short audio clip or maybe some song lyrics and try to write down exactly what you hear.
And the script describes it as active listening on steroids, which I find hilarious, but also accurate. It sounds deceptively simple, but that exercise really forces you to become an active listener. You're not just passively taking in sounds. You're training your brain to distinguish individual words, to really grasp the rhythm and the intonation of the language.
Yeah, it's a workout for your ears.
Okay, now let's move on to a technique that I think a lot of people might find intimidating, but is incredibly effective. Shadowing. Have you ever tried this?
Oh yeah, shadowing. It's one of my favorites. It's like you're a vocal detective trying to mimic a native speaker as closely as possible.
And you're not just repeating words, you're paying attention to their pronunciation, their tone, even their pauses and breaths.
Exactly. The script compares it to being a smarter parrot, which I love. It captures the essence of shadowing while also highlighting its effectiveness. You're not just mimicking mindlessly, you're analyzing and internalizing the nuances of spoken English.
And that's where the smarter part comes in. By consciously mimicking, you're actually training your mouth muscles to produce those same sounds, those same inflections, like giving your tongue a workout at the gym.
I've never thought of it that way, but it makes sense.
So we've talked about setting goals, the importance of listening, and this intriguing technique of shadowing. But what about that elephant in the room? That fear that so many learners face, the fear of actually speaking the language, putting yourself out there and risking making mistakes.
It's such a common fear, and the script tackles it head on. It acknowledges that speaking anxiety is a very real thing, especially when you're worried about making mistakes.
It's like stage fright, but for conversations, right? And the script has a surprisingly simple message about those dreaded mistakes. It encourages learners to see them as opportunities for growth rather than failures.
I love that. It's all about shifting your perspective. Instead of beating yourself up for a grammatical error or mispronounced word, you reframe it as valuable feedback.
And to help learners overcome that mental block, the script offers this really creative exercise. It says, pretend you're a tour guide in your own home.
Oh, I like that one.
Yeah, you walk around your house and you describe everything you see in English.
What a fun way to practice. And it's a safe, low-pressure environment, too.
Yeah.
There's no audience to judge you except maybe your cat.
Exactly. It takes the pressure off and allows you to just have fun with the language. It's like turning your house into your own personal language playground.
That's a great way to put it.
So we've covered a lot of ground already. We've talked about finding your why, setting achievable goals, the power of listening, the magic of shadowing, and even how to overcome the fear of speaking. But now it's time to tackle a topic that often causes learners to groan: grammar.
Dun, dun, dun.
But before you reach for the aspirin, I think you'll appreciate how the script approaches it. It reframes grammar as something less intimidating and more like
More like what?
a game.
A game. Okay, I'm intrigued.
It explains that grammar is simply the set of rules that govern how a language works. Once you understand those rules, you can play the language more effectively.
So it's like learning the rules of chess. Sure, you can move the pieces randomly, but if you want to win, you need to understand how they all work together.
Exactly. And to illustrate this point, the script uses the classic subject-verb-object sentence structure. Like the simple sentence, I eat apples.
Ah, yes. The building blocks of English.
Right. It seems basic, but that simple structure is the foundation for building countless sentences in English. It's like learning the alphabet before you can write a novel.
You've got to start somewhere.
Okay, so we've tackled grammar, but what about the other side of language expression writing? How does the script approach that?
Well, speaking of putting those new words and grammar rules to use, the script has a practical and surprisingly enjoyable suggestion. Keep a journal in English.
Now, I know some people might be rolling their eyes at that, thinking, journaling, that's so old school, but hear me out.
Okay, I'm listening.
Journaling isn't just for angsty teenagers. It's a fantastic tool for anyone learning a language. It forces you to think in English, to actively use the vocabulary and grammar you've been learning. And the beauty of journaling is that it's a judgment-free zone.
So you can make mistakes, experiment, find your own voice.
Precisely. And here's a bonus. As you write, you're bound to encounter words you don't know. This prompts you to look them up and add them to your vocabulary arsenal.
It's like built-in vocabulary expansion. I like that.
Yeah, and the act of writing itself helps cement those new words in your memory. So it's a win-win.
Definitely. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. The importance of defining your why, setting achievable goals, the power of listening, the magic of shadowing, and even those trickier topics of grammar and writing. But before we move on to the next part, I want to hear from you. What stood out to you the most from this part of the script? Was there anything that surprised you or made you think differently about learning English?
I'm curious to hear your thoughts too.
What really struck me is how the script intertwines practical advice with this really encouraging, almost playful tone. It's not just telling you what to do, it's making you feel like you can actually do it and have fun along the way.
I totally agree. It's like the script itself is a cheerleader urging you forward on your language learning journey. And we'll be back soon to continue our deep dive into Learn English at Home. But for now, we'll leave you with that question to ponder. Surprised you? What resonated? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, we're continuing our exploration of the Learn English at Home podcast, and this time we're diving into the second half. It's like the unexplored territory.
It is kind of like that. Last time we explored some key strategies for laying those really clear goals, not being afraid to make mistakes, and even trying out techniques like shadowing. Did you have a favorite technique from the first part?
I have to go with shadowing. It's just so much fun, and it really helps you get a feel for the rhythm of the language.
It's like you become the speaker you're trying to learn from. Yeah. And then we talked about turning your house into a language. Remember that one?
Oh yeah, like pretending you're giving a tour of your home in English.
Yeah.
That's a great way to practice speaking without feeling self-conscious.
Exactly. So as we move into this next section of the script, I'm curious to see what other gems we uncover.
Me too. One thing that caught my attention right away was the focus.
Oh yeah, that's right. It's interesting because you might think a script about learning at home would assume people have limited access to resources. But that's not the case at all.
Not at all. Script actually embraces this idea of resourcefulness. Yeah. It reminds us that we're living in this amazing time. Many language learning tools right at our fingertips.
And so many of them are free or very affordable.
Exactly. And they're not just limited to sources like textbooks or language learning software.
So what kind of resources does the script recommend?
Well, it encourages learners to explore everything from language exchange apps to online dictionaries to YouTube channels dedicated to teaching English, and even podcasts made just for language learners.
Podcasts about learning English. That's meta.
It is a bit meta. But hey, it works. And the script even suggests utilizing resources that you might not immediately think of as language learning tools.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, let's say you love cooking. Why not watch cooking shows in English? Or if you're a gamer, try playing a video game with the dialogue and subtitles set to English.
I see what you mean. It's about finding ways to immerse yourself in the language through your hobbies and interests.
Precisely. And it makes the whole learning process so much more enjoyable.
Totally. But it's not just about having access to all these resources. It's also about knowing how to use them effectively, right?
You're right. The script goes beyond just listing resources. It offers specific tips on how to get the most out of them.
Like what kind of tips?
Well, for instance, when using language learning apps, it cautions against just passively clicking through exercises.
So don't just treat it like a game where you're just trying to get to the next level.
Exactly. It encourages learners to really engage with the material, take notes, repeat phrases out loud, and try to use those new words and grammar structures in actual conversations.
So it's about being an active participant in your learning journey, not just a passive consumer of information.
Exactly. It's like anything else in life. You get out what you put in.
So true. Okay, we've talked about resources, but now let's shift gears a bit and address something that I think every language learner struggles with at some point.
Oh, what's that?
Staying motivated. Let's be honest, learning a new language can be challenging. There will be days when you feel frustrated, discouraged, maybe even tempted to give up.
Oh, absolutely. I've been there many times. And the script doesn't sugarcoat this reality. It acknowledges that motivation can ebb and flow.
Yeah.
And it provides some really helpful strategies for dealing with those inevitable slumps.
So it's like a pep talk for language learners.
Kind of. One suggestion that stood out to me was this idea of creating a language learning routine. It's about establishing a consistent time and place for studying, even if it's just for 15 minutes each day.
It's like making an appointment with yourself to learn.
Exactly. And the power of routine shouldn't be underestimated. When something becomes a habit, it requires less willpower and becomes more ingrained in your daily life.
I like that, creating a habit loop for language learning, so you're not relying on motivation alone.
Right. And speaking of support systems, the script also highlights the importance of finding a language learning community.
Oh, that's a good one. So it could be an online forum, a local language exchange group, or even just a friend who's also learning English.
Any of the above. Sharing your struggles and triumphs with people who understand what you're going through can make a huge difference.
Yeah, it's like you're all in this together.
Exactly. And it helps to know that you're not alone in this journey.
Now, on a slightly different note, the script has this really interesting section where it talks about dealing with criticism.
Oh, right. Criticism from others about our language learning? Yeah, that can be tough.
It can be really disheartening, especially when it comes from people whose opinions you value.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're putting yourself out there, you're trying your best, and then someone comes along and rains on your parade.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to extinguish your language learning fire.
And the script acknowledges how tough that can be.
Yeah.
And it offers some advice on how to deal with it.
So what's the secret?
Well, it encourages learners to surround themselves with positivity, to seek out those supportive communities, and to remember that ultimately this is your journey.
Yeah, you're doing this for you, not for anyone else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you get to decide how you want to approach it and who you want to share it with.
Now, as we delve deeper into the second half of the script, I'm noticing a subtle shift in focus.
Oh, really?
What do you mean? Well, it seems like we're moving away from specific techniques and resources and more towards this broader idea of mindset. It's almost like the script is saying, okay, you've got the tools, now here's how to use them effectively.
That's a great observation. And the script provides some really insightful guidance on cultivating a growth mindset, which is essentially the belief that your abilities can be developed through hard work and dedication.
So it's about believing in yourself and your ability to learn.
Yes, and it's about embracing the challenges, seeing mistakes as opportunities for learning, and constantly striving to improve.
So it's not about being perfect. It's about progress.
Exactly. The script reminds us that fluency isn't something you achieve overnight. It's a journey that unfolds over time with consistent effort and a willingness to learn from those setbacks.
And it's about enjoying the process, right? Savoring those small victories, those aha moments, and the thrill of connecting with a new language and culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we want to leave you with something to ponder. What are some of your go-to resources for learning English? What strategies help you stay motivated when the going gets tough? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Wow, it's hard to believe we're already at the final part of our deep dive into this Learn English at Home script. It feels like we just started.
I know, right? Time flies when you're having fun learning English.
And we have covered so much ground, haven't we? From the importance of defining your why and setting those achievable goals to embracing mistakes and exploring all those fantastic resources.
And remember those techniques. We talked about shadowing and turning your house into a language playground.
It's been quite a journey, but I feel like this last part of the script really brings everything together. It takes it to a whole new level.
You're right. It goes beyond just the mechanics of language learning and really delves into the transformative power of learning English. It's pretty inspiring, actually.
Yeah, it emphasizes that learning English isn't just about acquiring knowledge. It's about personal growth and expansion.
It's like learning a new language can change the way you think, the way you see the world, even the way you interact with others. It's pretty amazing.
You know, it's funny, I thought about it that way before. But the script really opened my eyes to the idea that language learning is about so much more than just memorizing words and grammar rules.
It's about pushing yourself outside your comfort zone, embracing new experiences, connecting with people from different cultures in a more meaningful way.
And the script highlights how learning English can open so many doors to new opportunities, right? Whether it's in your career, your personal life, or even just in terms of having access to more information.
The possibilities are endless.
Yeah.
It's like you're opening up a whole new world for yourself.
One thing that really resonated with me in this final section was the emphasis on celebrating your progress.
Yeah.
You know, taking the time to acknowledge how far you've come and all the accomplishments you've made along the way.
Oh, yeah, that's so important. It's easy to get caught up in that not yet fluent mindset where you're always focusing on what you haven't mastered yet instead of what you have.
Yeah, you're so focused on the destination that you forget to enjoy the journey.
Exactly. And the script encourages us to shift that perspective, to appreciate all those small wins along the way.
So did you finally master that tricky grammar rule? Did you have a conversation with a native speaker and actually understand what they were saying? Celebrate it.
Those are victories. And acknowledging those victories helps to keep you motivated and fuels that desire to keep learning and growing.
So we've talked about a lot of different aspects of learning English in this deep dive, but I think the script ultimately boils down to one simple but powerful message.
What's that?
Learning English is a gift. You're giving yourself a gift that will enrich your life in countless ways.
I love that. It's a gift that keeps on giving, expanding your horizons, enriching your experiences, connecting you with a global community.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Learn English at Home, we want to leave you with this one final thought. What is one small step you can take today to move closer to your English learning goals?
It doesn't have to be anything big or dramatic. It could be as simple as reviewing a few vocabularies or listening to a podcast episode in English, or even just writing a sentence or two in your journal.
The important thing is to just keep moving forward with time.
And remember, the most important ingredient in this whole language learning journey is to enjoy the process. Embrace the challenges, celebrate the victories, and never stop exploring the beautiful and ever-evolving world of English.
We hope you enjoyed this deep dive as much as we did, and we wish you all the best on your language learning adventure. Happy learning. Welcome to the deep dive. You know, today we're doing things a little differently. We're not just summarizing a podcast script. It's actually a pretty long one. It's called Learn English at Home, Your Ultimate Guide. And it's like 4 hours long.
Wow, 4 hours.
Yeah, so we're not going to go through the whole thing, obviously, but we're going to pick out like the most interesting and useful parts. Think of it like a cheat sheet or like a highlight reel.
I like that. A cheat sheet to better English.
Exactly. And it doesn't matter if you're just starting out or if you've been learning English for a while, there's going to be something here for everyone. So let's dive right in.
Sounds good to me.
So the first thing that really struck me about this script was that it starts in a kind of